Hey there. Welcome back to the Sleepy Dread. I'm Ollie, and I'm glad you're here. Tonight, I've got a story that's been sitting with me for a while. It's called The Upper Berth, written by F. Marion Crawford back in 1886, one of the earliest great horror stories set at sea. And I think you'll see why it stuck around. This is my retelling of it. Not word for word from the original, but the bones are the same. The dread is the same. So settle in, get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, and let's begin. It started, as these things sometimes do, at a dinner party. The kind of evening where the wine had been good and the conversation had wandered from politics to philosophy to places no one quite intended it to go. The candles had burned low. Most of the guests had already said their good nights, but a few of us lingered at the table, half drunk on port and the particular comfort of a warm room on a cold night. That's when Brisbane started talking. He was a tall man, Brisbane, broad across the shoulders, with hands like a dock worker's, though he was nothing of the sort. He had the look of someone who'd seen a great deal of the world and found most of it unremarkable. Not the kind of man who told ghost stories. Not the kind of man who believed in them. Which is why, when he leaned forward and said he had something to tell us, something that had happened to him aboard a ship called the Donatello, we all went quiet. Brisbane had crossed the Atlantic many times. He was the sort of traveler who kept his routines. Same shipping line, same time of year, and always, when he could manage it, the same cabin. Cabin 105. It was on the starboard side, midship, down a narrow corridor that smelled of brass polish and old wood. A small room, 2 berths, one above the other, a washstand bolted to the wall, a porthole that looked out over the water. Nothing remarkable about it. That was the point. Brisbane liked things predictable. So when he boarded the Donatello that November, he went straight to the purser's office to confirm his arrangements. The purser was a man named Collins, thin and meticulous, the kind who remembered every passenger by name and cabin number. But when Brisbane asked for the key to 105, something changed in Collins's face. It was brief. Just a flicker, a tightening around the eyes, the way a man looks when he's been asked a question he'd hoped to avoid. 105, Collins repeated. He said it the way you'd say the name of someone who'd recently died. Brisbane noticed. He asked if there was a problem. Collins hesitated. Then he said no problem at all. He handed over the key and wished Brisbane a pleasant voyage. But his smile didn't reach his eyes, and as Brisbane turned to leave, he could have sworn he heard Collins mutter something under his breath. Something like, "God help him." The first night was uneventful. Almost. Brisbane unpacked his things, hung his coat on the hook behind the door, and settled into the lower berth with a book. The ship had left port that afternoon, and the sea was calm. He could hear the low hum of the engines, the creak of the hull, the occasional murmur of voices from the corridor. Familiar sounds, comforting ones. He'd been told he would have a roommate, a man named Thompson, booked into the upper berth. But Thompson hadn't appeared by the time Brisbane turned out the lamp, so he assumed the man was still in the saloon, drinking or playing cards. Brisbane slept. He woke sometime in the small hours. The cabin was dark. The ship rocked gently, and the air was cold. Not the ordinary chill of a November crossing. This was something else. A raw, wet cold, the kind that seeps into your chest and sits there. Brisbane pulled the blanket tighter and lay still, listening. The porthole was open. He could hear the sea through it, close and restless. Could feel the salt air moving across his face. He was certain he'd closed it before bed. He always closed it. He was meticulous about these things. He got up, crossed the cabin in the dark, and pushed the heavy brass-rimmed glass shut, fastened the nut that held it, checked it twice. Then he stood there for a moment, his hand on the cold metal, listening to the water rushing past on the other side. The upper berth was empty. The sheets were undisturbed. Thompson had never come. Brisbane climbed back into bed. He lay awake for a long time, watching the darkness, feeling that strange coal slowly fade from the room. In the morning, he told himself it was nothing. A latch that hadn't caught. The motion of the ship working it loose. These things happened. He went to breakfast and ate alone. Afterward, on the promenade deck, he ran into the ship's doctor, a man named Jennings. They'd crossed together before and had an easy acquaintance, the kind built on shared meals and long afternoons at sea. Brisbane mentioned cabin 105. He mentioned the cold, the open porthole, the absent roommate. He said it lightly, the way you'd mention a leaky faucet. But Jennings didn't laugh. Jennings set down his coffee and looked at Brisbane for a long moment. Then he said very quietly that Brisbane should ask for a different cabin. Brisbane asked why. Jennings told him. 3 men had occupied the upper berth of cabin 105 on recent crossings. 3 men on 3 separate voyages. Each of them had gone overboard during the night. The first was found floating 2 days later. The second was never recovered. The third had been pulled from the water by a fishing vessel, but he was dead by then, his face frozen in an expression that the fishermen refused to describe. The shipping line had investigated. They'd found nothing. No signs of foul play, no evidence of suicide. The porthole in each case had been found open, though the men who'd occupied the lower berth swore they'd closed it. The official conclusion was misadventure. Sleepwalking, perhaps. Or drunkenness. But the crew knew better. The stewards drew lots to see who would have to service the cabin. The night watch avoided that stretch of corridor after midnight. And the purser, Collins, had tried 3 times to have the cabin permanently locked. Each time the company had refused. Empty cabins meant lost revenue. Brisbane listened to all of this. He thanked Jennings for the warning. And then he said he intended to stay exactly where he was. He wasn't a superstitious man. He didn't believe in hauntings or curses or things that went bump in the night. He believed in locked portholes and solid brass fittings and the basic indifference of the universe. If something was opening that porthole, it had a mechanical explanation. And he meant to find it. That afternoon, Brisbane went to see the captain. The captain was a weathered Scotsman named McAllister, with a white beard and eyes the color of the North Sea. He'd commanded the Donatello for 11 years and knew every rivet in her hull. Brisbane asked about Thompson, the man who'd been assigned to his cabin, the man who'd never arrived. McAllister checked the passenger manifest. Then he checked again. Then he sent for Collins. There was no Thompson on the manifest. There had never been a Thompson. But Collins insisted he'd booked the man in himself just 3 days before departure. He remembered the name, the handwriting on the ticket, the man's quiet voice. He'd been real. Collins was certain of it. But there was no record, no ticket stub, no luggage in the hold. It was as though the man had simply not existed. McAllister looked at Brisbane. Brisbane looked at McAllister. Neither of them said what they were thinking. The captain asked if Brisbane wanted to be moved. Brisbane said no. McAllister nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he respects a decision but doesn't agree with it. Then he said, "If you change your mind, come find me. Any hour, I'll be awake." The second night. The sky had turned gray by late afternoon, and the sea was rougher than it had been. Brisbane stood at the rail for a while before dinner, watching the water churn and fold beneath the hull. It was the color of slate, the kind of sea that swallows things without a trace. He ate dinner in the saloon but tasted nothing. The conversation around him was bright and ordinary. Someone's daughter was getting married. Someone else had opinions about the new railroad. And Brisbane sat through it, feeling as though he were listening from a great distance. He returned to the cabin at 9:30. He prepared carefully. He checked the porthole, closed it, tightened the brass nut until it wouldn't turn. He wedged his walking stick against the frame for good measure, jamming it between the porthole rim and the wall at an angle. Then he turned out the lamp and lay in the lower berth, watching the darkness above him. He didn't sleep. He didn't intend to. The hours passed. The ship swayed. The engines hummed their low, constant note. Somewhere far off, a door opened and closed. Footsteps in the corridor, fading. Then nothing. Brisbane lay still and listened. The cabin was a small world in the dark. He could hear the washstand faucet dripping, the creak of wood as the hull flexed against the sea, his own breathing, slow and measured. Around 2 a.m, he heard it, a sound from the porthole. Not the wind, not the sea. A slow, deliberate turning, metal against metal. The brass nut was moving. Brisbane sat up. In the faint light that came from under the cabin door, he could just make out the shape of the porthole. The nut was turning, slowly, steadily, as though someone or something were unscrewing it from the outside. The walking stick clattered to the floor. The porthole swung open, and the cold rushed in. It was the same cold as before, but worse, deeper. It didn't feel like air. It felt like water. Like the sea itself was pouring into the cabin, invisible and freezing. Brisbane lunged across the room and slammed the porthole shut. He held it there with both hands, pressing against the glass, and he could feel something pressing back. Not the wind. Something with weight behind it. Something with intent. Then it stopped. The pressure eased. The cold receded. Brisbane stood there in the dark, breathing hard, his hands still flat against the porthole glass. And above him, in the upper berth, something moved. He heard it clearly. The creak of the wooden frame, the rustle of sheets, a slow, wet sound like soaked fabric being dragged across a surface. There was something in the upper berth. Brisbane didn't move. He stood with his back to the washstand, staring up at the berth he couldn't see, listening to whatever was up there shift and settle. The smell hit him then. Brine and rot, and something older, something that made him think of things pulled from deep water, things that had been down too long. He didn't run. He wanted to. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to throw open the door and flee down the corridor. But he didn't. He was Brisbane. He didn't run from things he couldn't explain. He stood his ground and waited. The sounds stopped. The smell faded. The cold withdrew, slowly, like a tide going out. When Brisbane finally lit the lamp, his hands shaking despite himself, the upper berth was empty. The sheets were damp, not wet exactly, just damp, and cold to the touch. The porthole was shut. The brass nut was tight. He sat on the edge of his berth until dawn, watching the upper berth, watching the porthole, watching the darkness thin and gray, and finally give way to morning light. When the sun came up, it came up pale and weak through the porthole glass. The cabin looked ordinary again. Small and plain and slightly shabby, the way ships' cabins always look in the morning. The sheets on the upper berth had dried. They looked like any other sheets. If Brisbane hadn't felt the dampness with his own hands, hadn't smelled that deep ocean smell, he might have talked himself out of the whole thing. But he had felt it, and he couldn't. He found McAllister at breakfast and told him everything. The captain listened without interruption. When Brisbane finished, McAllister poured himself another cup of coffee, drank half of it, and said, "I believe you." He said it simply. No hesitation, no qualification. He'd heard similar things from other passengers over the years. Not all of them had been brave enough to stay the second night. None of them had stayed a third. Brisbane said he intended to stay a third. McAllister studied him. Then he said, "Not alone, you won't." They made a plan. That night, both of them would be in cabin 105. McAllister would bring a lantern. Brisbane would bring his nerve. Between the two of them, they'd see whatever there was to see. The third night, they entered the cabin together just after 10. McAllister carried a heavy ship's lantern that threw a warm, steady light across the small room. He set it on the washstand and adjusted the wick until the flame was bright and even. Then he closed the door and locked it. Brisbane checked the porthole. Closed. Tight. He'd had the ship's carpenter reinforce the latch that afternoon, adding a second brass fitting. It would take considerable force to open it now. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. McAllister sat on the lower berth. Brisbane leaned against the door. The lantern burned between them, filling the cabin with warm light and the faint smell of oil. They waited. An hour passed. Then 2. The ship rolled gently. The corridor outside was silent. McAllister's eyelids drooped, then snapped open. Brisbane shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The lantern flame held steady. Then, at midnight, the brass nut began to turn. They both heard it. They both saw it. The nut was turning by itself, slowly and deliberately, the metal gleaming in the lantern light. No hand touching it. No mechanism driving it. Just the nut, rotating counterclockwise, backing itself out of the fitting with a soft, grinding sound that set Brisbane's teeth on edge. McAllister stood up. He crossed the cabin in 2 strides and put his hand over the nut. He gripped it tight, and the nut kept turning. It turned against his grip, against the strength of a man who'd spent 40 years hauling rope and fighting North Atlantic storms. It turned as though his hand weren't there at all. The second fitting held for a moment longer. Then it, too, began to move. McAllister swore. He threw his weight against the porthole, both hands flat on the glass, and Brisbane was beside him in an instant, adding his strength to the captain's. Together, they held it. Together, they felt the thing on the other side pushing back. Then, the lantern went out. It didn't flicker. It didn't gutter. It simply died, as though someone had pinched the wick between wet fingers. The darkness was immediate and absolute. And in that darkness, the upper berth creaked. Brisbane felt it before he understood what was happening. Something cold and heavy dropped from the upper berth onto his back. It was wet, not damp the way the sheets had been. Soaking wet, the way a thing is wet when it's been in the ocean. It wrapped around him, arms or something like arms, and it was strong, terribly, impossibly strong. He couldn't see it. He could only feel it. Cold flesh, slick and yielding, pressing against his neck, his shoulders, his face. It smelled of the deep sea, of things that lived in darkness and pressure and silence. Its grip tightened. He felt his wrist bend at an angle that wrists don't bend, and he heard the bone snap, a clean, sharp sound that seemed very far away. Brisbane fought. He was a strong man. and fear made him stronger. He twisted and struck and threw himself against the walls of that tiny cabin, trying to shake the thing loose. McAllister was there too, grappling with something he couldn't see, shouting orders that no one could follow. It lasted seconds. It lasted forever. Brisbane couldn't tell. Then it was gone. The weight lifted. The cold withdrew. The wet, gripping presence simply wasn't there anymore. Brisbane fell against the washstand, cradling his broken wrist, gasping for air that tasted like salt and rust. McAllister found matches, struck one. The small flame showed them the cabin. The porthole was open, wide open. The night sea was visible through it, black and endless. Water dripped from the rim onto the floor. The upper berth was empty. The sheets were soaked through, heavy with seawater, and they dripped steadily onto the deck below. There was nothing else. No creature, no body, no evidence of what had held Brisbane down and broken his wrist with the casual strength of something that didn't care about bones or pain or the rules of the physical world. Just the open porthole, the wet sheets, and the smell of the deep ocean already fading. Neither of them spoke for a long time. McAllister relit the lantern with steady hands and set it back on the washstand. Brisbane sat on the floor with his back against the door, his broken wrist cradled in his lap, staring at the open porthole and the darkness beyond it. After a while, McAllister closed the porthole. He didn't bother with the nut. There was no point. He just pushed it shut and held it there, and they both listened to the sea on the other side, and neither of them said what they were thinking. When they finally left the cabin, the corridor was empty. The ship creaked and swayed around them. Somewhere, a clock struck 3. McAllister had the cabin sealed the next morning. Not locked, sealed. He ordered the ship's carpenter to nail the door shut, drive bolts through the frame, and fix a steel plate over the porthole from the outside. He entered it in the ship's log as unfit for habitation due to structural damage. It was a lie, and everyone aboard knew it was a lie, but no one questioned it. Brisbane's wrist was set by Dr. Jennings. It healed in time, though he said it ached in cold weather for the rest of his life. A reminder. Not that he needed one. He never sailed on the Donatello again. He never asked for Cabin 105. He crossed the Atlantic a few more times on other ships, other lines, and he always requested a cabin without an upper berth. He never explained why. People assumed it was a preference, a quirk. They didn't press. He never learned what had been in that upper berth. Never learned where it went when the porthole closed, or where it came from when it opened. Never learned why it had chosen that particular cabin on that particular ship, or whether it was still there, behind the steel plate and the nailed-shut door, waiting in the dark for someone to let it out again. And this, I think, is the part that stayed with him longest. Not the cold, not the broken wrist, but the not knowing. The understanding that some things exist outside the reach of reason, and that all the brass fittings and rational explanations in the world won't keep them out. Some things don't have explanations. Some stories don't have endings. They just stop, the way a sound stops when you close a window, and you're left with the silence and the knowledge that the sound is still out there, somewhere, on the other side of the glass. Brisbane finished his story. The dining room was very quiet. The candles had burned down to nothing. Someone refilled his glass, and he drank without seeming to notice. No one asked questions. There weren't any to ask. He'd told them what happened, plainly and without embellishment, and either you believed him or you didn't. His expression suggested he didn't much care which. He excused himself shortly after, said good night, walked out with his shoulders straight and his broken wrist held carefully at his side, and none of us ever spoke of it again. And that, my friends, is The Upper Berth, a story about a man who didn't believe in the unexplainable until the unexplainable wrapped its arms around him in the dark. Crawford wrote this one over 140 years ago, and it still holds up. Still makes you want to check the window before you turn out the light. There's something about the ocean at night, isn't there? All that water, all that dark, all the things we'll never see down there. But you don't need to worry about any of that tonight. You're safe. You're warm. You're right where you're supposed to be. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. And if you're still awake, well, that's all right too. Close your eyes. Let the quiet settle in. Good night from Ollie. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time on The Sleepy Dread.